The submitted materials forcefully argue that enterprise tax teams, rather than IT departments, must take ownership of technology architecture and data decisions to prevent operational disruptions in real-time, continuous transaction control environments. This is an incredibly strong, well-researched, and honestly, urgently needed perspective. But to maximize its impact, we are going to focus our critique on 3 key areas of editorial refinement. The persuasive power of these pieces is currently hindered by an adversarial tone toward IT departments, which risks alienating the very stakeholders required to implement the proposed changes.
Yeah, that dynamic is exactly where we need to start. I mean, the material does an exceptional job of creating a burning platform, really making the reader feel the stakes. But reading through the subheadings, it paints the IT department as this well-meaning but fundamentally dangerous actor.
Right.
For instance, the author uses a header stating, "The CIO is designing your compliance architecture. That should concern you." And later on, the text claims these critical data decisions are defaulting to IT simply because the tax function is failing to claim them.
It creates a very distinct us versus them framing, right?
Exactly, throughout the entire first half of the manuscript. But here is the vulnerability in the text. If the author's ultimate goal, which they state clearly in the conclusion, is to establish regular review meetings and collaborative organizational relationships, handing this document to a CIO is going to burn the bridge before anyone even sits down at the conference table.
So a key theme running through this material seems to be the absolute necessity of cross-functional integration, yet the language actively creates division. But let me challenge the core premise here for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
Is it really a turf war? It feels more like 2 pilots fighting for the controls in the cockpit, when the narrative should really be about the co-pilots stepping up because the captain is flying blind through regulatory fog. Would framing this as an organizational blind spot rather than an IT overreach make the argument more palatable to a corporate audience?
Oh, that framing is vastly closer to the reality on the ground. IT leaders aren't, sitting around in dark rooms scheming about how to steal the tax department's thunder.
Exactly.
They are dealing with a severe structural misalignment. They are tasked with upgrading and optimizing massive global ERP systems, and suddenly they are getting hit with hyperlocal mandates from Poland or Italy that require granular tax data.
Like the specific customs codes or unit of measure conversions.
Right, things that the core ERP doesn't natively track. They are trying to build the plane while flying blind, precisely because they don't have the regulatory blueprints. So, the strategic pivot here is to fundamentally recalibrate the tone.
Make it more cooperative?
Yes, the author needs to frame this situation as a unified partnership built on distinct, complementary expertise, rather than a turf war over who gets the final sign-off.
Let's pause on that IT motivation, because I think the text misreads the corporate dynamic entirely. The author writes as if IT eagerly wants to own tax compliance. In my experience with enterprise transformations, CIOs are absolutely desperate to offload regulatory liability to the experts.
Oh, completely.
They do not want to be the reason the company gets fined for a VAT error in Brazil. So if we look at those confrontational headers, they are prime real estate for a tone shift. Instead of, the CIO is designing your compliance architecture, that should concern you. What if we flip the script?
What are you thinking?
Something like, why your CIO needs your tax expertise to build a resilient architecture.
That subtle shift completely alters the reception of the document. You are moving the conversation from, "Stop doing my job," to, "Let me give you the tools you need to succeed at yours." It aligns the incentives.
Because IT wants a clean ERP and tax wants compliance.
Right. The IT team wants successful, high-performing ERP implementation. The tax team wants accurate, defensible compliance. To make this actionable, the author should scrub the document for dismissive phrases.
Do you have an example from the text?
Yeah, for example, there's a line about IT professionals who understand the systems but do not understand the regulatory requirements. The author should change that to something collaborative, such as IT professionals whose core mandate is system optimization, not tracking fluid global tax mandates.
It elevates the conversation from a complaint to a strategic alignment. But getting the CIO to welcome you to the table only solves half the problem. Once the global head of tax is actually sitting in that steering committee, we hit a massive structural void in the text.
I noticed that too.
The actionable roadmap for building tax technology governance is underdeveloped compared to the thorough, deeply granular diagnosis of the architectural problem.
The contrast between the problem identification and the solution in this manuscript is, well, it's quite jarring. The section detailing the 4 tax technology decisions is a masterclass in technical writing.
It really is.
It gets into the canonical data model, specific jurisdictions like Italy's Fatturpie versus Poland's KSF, the dangers of embedding tax logic directly into ERP custom code. It is incredibly authoritative and deep.
But then we hit the solution section.
Right, we reach the section titled How to Claim the Seat at the Table, and it essentially just issues commands. It says to build technical capability and establish organizational mandates. It completely omits the operational how.
As I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that tax professionals need to engage credibly in architecture discussions to protect the business. But is it realistic to expect a global head of tax, who has spent 20 years mastering corporate tax law and transfer pricing, to suddenly master standard APIs versus ERP-embedded Z programs without a dedicated hiring strategy or a phased transition plan?
It is completely unrealistic, and that is the exact friction point the reader will experience. A tax director is going to read this piece, agree entirely with the premise, and then sit at their desk on Monday morning with zero idea of what their first email should actually say.
So how do we fix that?
To fix this, the author needs to expand the solution section to include a concrete maturity model. They must provide a step-by-step transitional framework demonstrating exactly how a traditional tax team operationalizes this new governance authority over time, rather than expecting an overnight transformation.
Let's unpack what that framework actually looks like, because we can't just tell the author to add a framework without giving them the blueprint. What is phase 1? It can't be learn to code Python.
No, absolutely not.
It has to be something native to a tax professional's existing skill set that bridges the gap to IT.
Exactly. Phase 1 should focus heavily on immediate data requirements, translating tax knowledge into an IT artifact. For instance, the text could suggest the tax team create a jurisdiction-specific tax requirements checklist for the canonical data model.
Okay, I follow.
The tax team is already researching global tax rules. This step just asks them to format that research into a binary checklist of data fields required by different countries. IT can actually use that artifact to configure the ERP.
Wait, let me press you on that checklist idea, because I can hear the IT architects groaning already.
Why is that?
Well, a canonical data model is designed to be a universal, standardized data structure across the entire global enterprise. If the tax team starts handing IT a checklist that says Italy requires this highly specific XML tag and Spain requires this completely different invoicing field, aren't they basically destroying the concept of a canonical model by forcing it to accommodate hyperlocal edge cases?
That is exactly the tension the author needs to explore. You are spot on. IT will push back and say, we can't add 50 custom data fields to our core global model.
So how does the tax leader handle that?
So phase 1 isn't just tossing a list over the wall. It is guiding the tax leader on how to identify the intersection between standard business data and regulatory requirements. The author needs to show the tax leader how to negotiate which core data points must live in the ERP versus what gets enriched downstream by an external engine.
Okay, so phase 1 is data translation and establishing that baseline negotiation. What does phase 2 look like once that data foundation is set?
Phase 2 is institutionalizing the authority. The tax should advise establishing a joint tax IT steering committee specifically dedicated to evaluating vendor RFPs.
But they can't just say, make a committee.
Right. Don't just say make a committee. The author should provide 3 concrete questions the tax leader must mandate be included in every IT procurement document. This inserts the tax function into the software purchasing lifecycle before a fundamentally incompatible system is ever bought.
And it doesn't require the tax director to become a software engineer.
Exactly.
And then phase 3 has to address the elephant in the room, the talent pool. You can only get so far with steering committees and checklists. The text has to explicitly recommend a structural hiring strategy.
Yes, the human element.
the author needs to introduce the concept of hiring dedicated tax technologists. These are hybrid professionals. Expecting traditional CPAs to intuitively grasp network latency, cloud architecture, or API payload limits is a recipe for organizational burnout.
It really is.
By laying out these 3 phases, the data translation checklist, institutionalizing the procurement committee, and executing a hybrid hiring strategy, the author transforms a theoretical, daunting directive into a highly actionable operational roadmap.
It completely closes the loop. The reader moves from understanding the existential urgency of the problem to having a clear, calendar-based plan for solving it.
Which leads us directly into the reality of what happens when that tax leader actually sits down at the steering committee table with IT to make their pitch. By presenting the externalized compliance platform as an undisputed silver bullet, the material overlooks the valid technical counterarguments that IT will inevitably raise regarding risk and system performance.
This is arguably the most dangerous blind spot in the narrative. The author advocates fiercely for externalizing tax logic outside the ERP core via standard APIs.
Right, keeping the ERP clean.
Exactly. The premise is that this keeps the ERP clean and agile, avoiding the nightmare of custom coding tax rules into the system. Theoretically, it's a beautiful concept, but it completely ignores the harsh mechanics of a real-time, continuous transaction control environment, or CTC.
The real-time aspect changes everything.
Yes, because in a true CTC framework, an invoice legally does not exist until the government clears it.
Let's dig into the why behind that, because the text glosses over the mechanics entirely. In the old days, you processed your invoices in your ERP, shipped the goods, and at the end of the month, you send a summary report to the tax authority.
Right, the post-audit model.
Yeah, if your tax calculation software went down for an hour on a Tuesday, nobody noticed. You just ran the batch later. But in a modern CDC model, the ERP has to ask the external tax engine for permission before an invoice can even be issued to the customer or the truck can leave the loading dock.
Which all happens instantly.
Right. That request happens over an external API call.
Precisely. And that introduces a massive operational vulnerability that IT is terrified of. Latency. If your enterprise processes 50,000 invoices an hour and your external tax engine takes 300 milliseconds to respond to each of those API calls, that delay compounds.
The ERP slows down.
The ERP slows down. More importantly, what happens if the external vendor's server goes down entirely? Your entire billing operation halts. Revenue recognition stops.
Wow.
Yeah, so when a tax leader pitches this beautiful externalized vision, the CIO is going to immediately point out these risks. And the current text leaves the tax leader looking incredibly naive.
It's like selling a house based purely on the beautiful view without acknowledging it's built on a fault line.
That's a great way to put it.
The view is the externalized regulatory agility, the incredible ability to update compliance rules without touching the ERP core. But IT's job is to worry about the fault line, the system latency, and the API outages. If we don't address the fault line, IT won't buy the house.
To fix this, the author needs to preemptively acknowledge and address these technical counterarguments within the text itself. Don't hide from the latency issue. Shine a massive spotlight on it.
Right. Bring it up before IT does.
Exactly. Equip the reader with specific counter strategies so they are prepared for the inevitable rebuttal. For example, the text can propose that the tax team demand strict service-level agreements, or SLAs, with the external vendor, mandating 99.99% uptime with severe financial penalties for latency spikes.
But let's play devil's advocate here. An SLA is just a piece of paper. If I'm the enterprise architect, an SLA doesn't magically keep my billing system running when a fiber optic cable gets severed.
Fair point.
A vendor paying a financial penalty doesn't help me explain to the board of directors why we couldn't invoice our biggest global customer for 6 hours at the end of the quarter. The text needs an architectural compromise, not just a legal one.
That is a fantastic point, and it leads straight to the ultimate mitigation strategy the author must include: offline fallback processing.
How does that work?
The text needs to equip the tax leader to say, we will use an external API to keep the ERP clean, but we will design an offline fallback mechanism. If the external tax engine fails to respond within 300 milliseconds, the ERP is architecturally authorized to proceed with the transaction using a locally cached set of baseline tax rules.
Wait, hold on.
If we use locally cached tax rules during a network outage, aren't we instantly out of compliance the moment the government changes the mandate? The whole point of externalizing the logic was to avoid maintaining those rules inside the ERP in the first place.
But that is where the reconciliation mechanism comes in. And this is the exact nuance the author needs to explain to their readers. The cached rules aren't meant to be perfectly compliant. They are meant to be good enough to keep the business running and the trucks moving.
Okay, I see where this is going.
The system is designed to flag those specific offline transactions. Once the API connection is restored, the external tax engine automatically reviews the flagged transactions, calculates the delta based on the latest, most accurate rules, and automatically issues a credit or debit note to reconcile the difference with the government authority. It is a calculated, manageable risk designed to ensure business continuity.
That transforms the entire dynamic of the conversation. If the tax leader walks into the room and says, I want an external API, I fully acknowledge the latency and outage risks, and here is my proposal for a cached fallback with automated post-outage reconciliation, the IT architects will instantly respect them as a peer.
Exactly.
They aren't just reciting tax law from an ivory tower, they are actively engaging in enterprise architecture.
It completely insulates the proposal from the inevitable pushback. The author has built a brilliant case for why tax must own this space. By addressing the granular technical realities of API latency and fallback processing, they ensure the proposal actually survives the brutal scrutiny of an IT design review.
Let's concisely recap the 3 actionable steps to elevate this material. First, soften the adversarial tone. Frame the situation not as a turf war where IT is overstepping, but as a structural misalignment where IT desperately needs the regulatory blueprints that only the tax team can provide.
Right.
Second, flesh out the how-to section. Provide a concrete phased maturity model from data translation checklists to establishing procurement steering committees to hiring dedicated hybrid tax technologists.
Crucial step.
And third, bulletproof the architectural argument by preemptively addressing IT's latency concerns. Equip the reader with mitigation strategies like offline fallback processing and automated reconciliation to handle API outages in real-time environments. We explicitly invite you to implement these actionable suggestions, revise the material, and submit it back in for a future critique so we can see how the piece evolves. Until then, remember that navigating regulatory fog is impossible if the co-pilot is fighting for the controls instead of reading the instruments. Equip your team to guide the flight, and the whole enterprise lands safely.